Hi, host Eric here, and I'm confident Abraham will follow suit. I'm going to be speaking today in a loud voice, both because we're outside and reasonably far from the camera. Now, I was alarmed to discover earlier my friend Abraham here. I'm host Eric, by the way. We're talking with famous people. I didn't say that already. He was saying some pretty racist stuff, so I wanted to call him out on it here. Let's see how it goes. Abraham, you want to repeat what you were saying earlier?
Okay, so let's get to the bottom of the discussion, right? The reason I said why this kind of discussion started off was because I told Eric, bear in mind I don't have the sufficient enough background knowledge about what All Lives Matter specifically stands for, right? But anyways, there was a picture that I found online where it was an African American lady and she was crying, right? And it was like a profile picture, and there was a white person's hand, and it was covering that person's face, sort of like this. And essentially, what the caption said, I don't remember the exact wording, but what it said was something along the lines of, "This is what it means when you say all lives matter, following the creation of Black Lives Matter." And what I told Eric was, what the conclusion that I draw based off of that picture was basically all lives matter is sort of like a I can't necessarily come up with the exact word for it, but it's sort of like an indirect saying, hey, you can't be sophisticated and say that only Black Lives Matter, which I think is entirely sort of a dumb argument in and of itself, right?
Basically, you're saying it's totally fair and reasonable for an oppressed group, such as African Americans, to single out their own oppression, because after all, they're the ones who are singled out by the oppression. Yes?
Right. They should be able to. It's not that they should be able to. I feel like it's good to justify them pointing out like their sort of.
It's good to side with them in general about these issues.
It's good to acknowledge these things.
And it's good to say that racism is bad and that we
and
can
it's good
address
to
it.
be an advocate, not for racism, but like for anything that follows suit, right?
But so if we're dealing with police brutality, it's good to frame it as through the framing of racism, because it's accurate, because that's who's being targeted.
Well, what do you mean by who's being targeted?
Well, I'm trying to get you to I'm trying to help you actually to explain your position as well as you possibly can before I defeat it. Okay. So, basically, if I were to make your argument as well as I possibly could, I'd be saying this. I'd be saying, the fact is, the statistics show that people who self-identify as a given race, namely African American, are much more likely to be targeted by the police. Now, we could argue back and forth about whether or not they're actually African American or not, but the reality is, for all intents and purposes, most people are going to agree on a person's racial identity, if they are within a certain range of skin color. So, and the reality is that people do pay judgment on that, and therefore racism is a real problem. It's silly to think we could address the problem of police violence against mostly black people without addressing the fact that it's mostly against black people. We have to bring race into account. I would make all of those sort of arguments, right?
Right. And following that, Eric said something along the lines of, I forgot where the discussion was headed towards, but we were talking about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And, that, in my opinion, I think slavery is just an example of, like, a prime example, to be exact, of what African American, sort of oppression and, like, a struggle that they had gone through, those type of things, right?
I mean, I want to stress, I am in complete agreement that slavery is an abomination. That the individual human beings who suffered at the hands of slavery were violated in the worst possible way, and that the oppressors should be held to account.
I do believe that was an act of racism.
Obviously, I don't agree with that, though.
And Eric believes it was, what's that word, the P?
Under.
Eric believes that when racism was around, when slavery was around, that slavery was just an act of plunderism, whatever,
yeah.
Right? I completely disagree with that. I feel like, okay, because right now we're talking about two things. We'll come back to, like, racism and police brutality stuff, right? But
we are talking about two things, but there's two other things we're talking about. We're talking about the actual behavior observed and what you deduce is in people's heads. Those are two different things.
Okay, but social-wise, we're talking about those things. Social-wise, okay?
Wait, social-wise, we're talking about the cops, and we're talking about what?
Slavery.
Okay, go ahead.
So, with that being said, I think I was talking about slavery. I believe that slavery was like a complete example of racism. I don't think it was just like pondering or not pondering, whatever you said it was.
So is it your position then, if I was a slave owner, I owned slaves because I was racist?
Yeah, I completely agree. Not because you were racist, but because you felt that way against certain. Yeah. Yeah.
Would
because
it
think about it.
Let me ask you this though, Abraham.
Yeah.
Would it be more okay if I owned slaves for non-racist reasons?
No,
It wouldn't?
it wouldn't. But basically, slavery was fueled by racism.
So what's wrong with slavery? Is it the fact that it's racist?
Everything's wrong with it. It's the fact that
Well, you just said it would still be just as wrong if it weren't racist.
racism within slavery is just one factor that makes it bad. I'm not saying that without racism in slavery, that slavery is
where's
good.
the racism? Where do we see the racism?
Well, first of all, you're singling out one race or like people with specific characteristics, and you're putting them like under your boot. You're basically saying that they're less than a human being.
The behavior then you're talking about is a systematic violation of rights of a whole set of individuals, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so where does the racism come in?
Well, when you're targeting a specific group of people with certain characteristics.
If you have a group of people that is enslaved, well, hold on, hold on one second. If you have a whole bunch of individuals who are enslaved, wouldn't that make them a group, an oppressed group, regardless of whatever qualities they share?
Yeah, but I mean,
if we're talking about not the shared quality.
But if we're talking about slavery in the past, we can obviously note that most of those people were African American, right?
Well,
so
I mean,
you can't single out and make a sort of like a hypothetical example and say that if a group of people are slaves,
it's not hypothetical. There have been plenty of examples of slavery in history that didn't involve black people.
Okay.
So are you saying that black slavery is worse than other slavery?
No.
So then, where does the racism come into play?
It was fueled by racism.
So if it weren't racism, there wouldn't be slavery. Is that your point?
No, not entirely.
Because actually, what the observable behavior is plunder. Individual human beings who own their own bodies, who have their property plundered from them by villainous plunderers. Now, these are individual plunderers individually plundering other individuals' property. However, this is the worst part of all. This is what slavery proved more than anything else, is how desperately we need to not talk about race. Because the real problem here is what? The government, of course. Who made slavery possible as an institution? It wasn't individuals, because those individuals were acting in defiance of constitutional principles and the law as it was written. They had to make special exceptions for these human beings in order to do what? In order to justify the plunder, not in order to justify the racism. People didn't go out of their way to spend money to get slaves because I know it's expensive to keep enslaving these black people, but we're going to keep doing it anyway because we hate black people so much. They did it because it was profitable. Because they were plundering other people's property. The problem here is the individual being plundered, not whatever shared trait they use to justify it. When you say it's a racist thing, you are conceding defeat to the people who are enslaving people. You're saying, yeah, we agree. This thing that you make up to justify your shitty behavior is actually a real thing. We're going to treat it as a real thing, and you win. That's what you were saying when you talk about race at all. It's reductive, it's divisive, it takes individual human beings who are distinct and unique and forms them into groups and then reduces them to specific attributes of those groups. It's wrong. I have all the moral high ground, and those of you who are out there who are on the left who think that you have the moral high ground on race are wrong, wrong, wrong.
Okay, so I will start off by saying that first of all, we're talking about African Americans specifically right now, citing the case of like slavery in the past. And another thing I want to point out is, let's say it was plundering, okay? Let's say it is plundering, okay? We'll use that sort of framework. That plundering was fueled by racism, right? You can't have like...
No, it was justified.
Why do you think after
it was
slavery...
justified.
What do you think... So you're saying racism justified it?
I'm saying people used racist narratives that we now identify as racist to justify plundering these individuals, right? There will always be justification. When the cops did the anal rape of Dennis Eckert in New Mexico.
Who's that?
He's a guy who, well, this is what happened. Is he was driving, they pulled him over. They got him out of the car. They said he was clenching his buttocks, and they had a judge actually sign off on a search warrant to have him undergo forced medical procedures to search his internal cavity for drugs. He had none. This went on for 8 to 10 hours. And they did multiple invasive procedures to try to find these drugs.
Okay, cool. So.
No, the point is this.
Yeah, what's the point?
What is the narrative they said after the fact as to why that was justified? Who the fuck cares? Do we focus on, well, see, this is why they're opposed to butt cheek clinchers. No, we don't think that. They'll use whatever goddamn narrative they can come up with to justify their own bad behavior. Their own bad behavior is based on one of two reasons. One, they're a bully. That's fairly frequent in cops. Or two, they're a plunderer if they're doing this on an institutional level. You're talking about something like slavery. Those are the two possible things. And even the cops are plunderers because ultimately they're supporting their own industry of engagement. And it's wrong because much of what people are engaged for aren't actual crimes because they're not seeking justice for any individual who's had their rights violated.
Okay, so your take on police brutality and police misconduct, in general, you're stating that everything leads to just simply people just having their rights violated, and the root of those cause of that result is based off of human behavior, human actions.
I mean, the
right?
cause is people talking like you're talking. When you put people into groups and you focus on that, then you justify rights violations. So like, yes, Bernie Sanders, he's going to help the oppressed people. What you really say is, I'm going to justify rights violations with this narrative, just like the cops do, just like the enslavers do. If you're justifying rights violations with some narrative, then you have no ethical high ground as far as I'm concerned, because you can't explain why you would justify this use of aggression that's not in response to any aggression that came first.
So you would justify police's aggression and sort of like, you know, like police misconduct and police brutality acts towards the African American community, which has been like really big in the past, right? Past year or so, whatever. So you would justify that as just police simply just trying to violate the rights of others? Is that what you're trying to say?
I would say the only way to meaningfully talk about that at all is to say in each individual instance where a police officer uses aggression, not in response to aggression, but in response to something like fear. Well, I was afraid for my life. If it is not in response to aggression, it has to be responsive. It cannot be preemptive. Then in those instances, we need to have the very real and concrete discussion of how many years in prison should this cop be put behind bars for, because he committed a real crime called violence against somebody who did not use violence. And that's a real crime. Now, if we talk about it in those framings, who the fuck cares if the cop violated the person's right because he didn't like the color of his skin, or because he thought he had a ugly hairdo, or because he had
a big issue. Of course,
he drove a Buick. Why does it matter? Why? What are you going to do about it? Nothing you can do except
because you have
violate
to
people's
advocate
rights.
for those type of things.
Advocate for what? What policy change do you want to make?
Well, fucking at least like police reform or something. Because
I'm telling you how to reform it right now.
There's an issue. There's an issue with systematic racism within police departments.
You need to talk about it.
There's an issue with systematic racism across police departments.
You don't know
States,
that,
right?
Which brains have you scanned and found the red spots as racism?
It's not that I know these things; it's that they're evident.
You can't know it because you're talking about people in mental processes. What you can know is that there's systematic misconduct in police departments. You can know
misconduct towards.
You can know that where the misconduct occurs in certain communities and other communities.
You can know towards
it's
who,
irrelevant.
Right?
The fact is, it's misconduct. Who the fuck cares if I stabbed you in the neck or the chest? If I killed you, that's the problem.
But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about who the misconduct.
What are you going to do about it, though? Why are you recommending a policy?
It's important to advocate for those type of things.
To advocate for what?
For change. So
what change, though? How about I throw
you
balloons at everybody? That's change.
Okay, but now that's silly. See, earlier I mentioned.
So what changed then?
Earlier I mentioned police reform,
which looks like what?
Look, we can get into specifics. There's probably tons of like project presentations that people have presented forth in regards to changing the way that police officers act.
It involves distinguishing between individuals on the criterion of race in order to gather data, to justify new policies, yada, yada, yada. It's a bad idea. And that's it. It's divisive. It's ontologically violent to each individual whenever one puts them as a member of a group. I don't like any label affixed to me. Obviously, I am white in the sense that everyone perceives me as such. I'm not saying I'm not. I don't understand that. I'm saying that that's something I think about. And you say, well, you're privileged. That's why you don't have to think about it. You're privileged. Okay, well, fine, but you're not talking about anything. You're just saying we should bitch about this, right? We should bitch about the cops being racist. But we don't even know if they are racist. You're talking about mental processes. There's no way to know if they're not saying.
So you're saying we should.
Hello, my name's Officer Bob, and I'm a fucking racist.
So you're saying we shouldn't do anything at all about these type of things?
I think we should absolutely do everything we ought to do, which is enforce individual rights by prosecuting the full extent of the law those who aggress against individuals and their rights.
But that
when
doesn't
police
happen.
officers use aggression, oh, I agree that's a fucking problem. I totally agree, and that's a prosecutor and police and whole law enforcement community problem.
Yeah.
And we need to address the hell out of that, but not through the lens of race.
It's
that plays right into their hands.
It's an issue in the justice system as well.
When you frame these
Race
things through the issue
look,
of race, you
look,
are playing right into their hands.
The reason that says why you have to look at through this these sort of things through the lens of race is because race plays a huge factor in these type of things.
Right, you are helping them
because
when you talk about it.
Because there's racism involved.
You're not thinking about it from an argumentation perspective. The cops, the prosecutors, everybody, they love for it to be framed in terms of race. Why? Because that's easy to argue against. They can generate evidence. We're not racist. Here's an example. Here's
Of course,
an example.
you can't. I agree
What's
with you.
hard to argue against is the bottom line is this, officer. I don't care why you aggressed against this individual citizen, but you aggressed. He used no violence. Why did you use violence against this citizen? What justified that violence? Forget about the fucking race. If the cop then says, oh, it's justified because he's black, well then fine. You know for a fact that he just confessed to the crime.
So, upon what you've been stating, you would probably agree that the group of Black Lives Matter, the formation of it, wasn't a good idea because it brings race into
It helps
play?
the cops. It helps the cops for sure.
Is that your conclusion?
It's not just my conclusion, it's the truth.
I can see like now that we kind of discuss these things, where that would be heading and how that would actually work out, but I still feel I don't know if I could say like liberal heart and say that you still have to be able to advocate and point these things out. And I know sometimes it may be difficult to change these type of things as they are a mental process, as you have stated. But
Dude, that's why it's counterproductive. That's why they want you to do that. They want you focusing on people's attitude, because that's endlessly squishy. No actual change, no actual accountability can be held when we're focusing on people's attitudes. That's why cops always get off on it. Well, no, did he have a legitimate fear for his life or not?
Okay.
We shouldn't be talking about fucking fear.
Okay,
he aggressed. Okay. He didn't. End of story.
Okay, what about slavery?
What about it?
What about slavery?
It's plunder. I told you that already. It's not racism.
It was plundering, but there was a lot of racism in
Those are just the narratives they used to justify it.
But what happened after slavery? What about that?
Well, I mean,
even before, African Americans were still treated like poop, right?
Well, I think you're looking at it from the wrong angle. You need to think of it like this: the people who were engaged in systematic plunder and oppression of other individual human beings were awful human beings. You can tell that because they were engaged in the systematic plunder and oppression of other individual human beings. Now, did they then choose to continue to commit ontological violence against those other individual human beings by grouping them and calling them a certain group name and then reducing them to certain derisive attributes that they've made up to attribute to that group? Yes, they did that. It's just exactly the same thing people who try to do it positively are doing, and they don't understand that. When you say something positive like Black Lives Matter, that sounds like, oh, this is a good thing, it reminds everybody that black people are being oppressed. No, that's a terrible, terrible thing. Because what it does is it focuses us on exactly the wrong thing. And remember, we can't focus on everything. We have to prioritize one thing or the other. You only have so many hours in the day, only so much time to think about it. How are you going to think about it? If you're thinking about it in terms of attitudes, you are thinking about it in a way that produces no solvency and ultimately plays right into the hands of the oppressors. Now, if you focus on one thing only, principle, right? You aggressed. Answer that. No, don't get distracted by anything else. All these voices on the side, blah, 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 blah. Those are all distractions from the central fucking point. This is an aggressor committing an act of aggression against a non-aggressor. It is fundamental to our system of justice, to every sense of decency in the world, that we hold those people accountable for acts of aggression, not for their attitudes. Boom. And that's how you put a handle on that shit.